All right, so chapter 6 begins in your book on page 362, and it is on validating forms. Remember, I believe, I could be wrong, I believe that, is it today that the chapter 5 exercises are due? So if you haven't turned those in, please turn them in. They may have even been due yesterday, I don't remember, but they will be graded tonight. All right, so enhancing and validating forms. One thing for you to realize, we've talked about this before, is with the advent of HTML5, there's less JavaScript typically than you have to put in, than you used to have to put in for validating forms. Because you know you can put the word required there, all right? You can say that a field is a number field. You can say that a field is a telephone field, etc. So there are things that are built in to HTML5. That said, most people still put some validation of forms in using JavaScript. And again, that's what this chapter is totally about. All right, so as it says, enhance form usability with JavaScript, customized browser-based HTML. That's what I just mentioned. So in my opinion, we don't have to talk about that because you already know how to use placeholders. You already know how to use the required attribute, etc. All right, and implement custom validation to check for errors and display error messages. The author just goes over this again. I'm not going to read it to you, but the author says in here that on the bottom of the page that typically what you do, and this seems to confuse people for whatever reason, and it's actually the first question on your review. You don't have to pull it out. It's okay. But the first question on the review is, should you do client-side script or client-side validation, or should you do server-side validation, or should you do both? The answer is both. You want to validate on the client side because if you validate on the client side and there's an error, you never have to send it to the server. That should make sense to everyone. If you've got a field that said it's a required field and you leave it blank, you should never send that out to the server so the server can tell you it's blank and send it back to you. That's a waste of the server's time. All right? You know, I've heard all sorts of different analogies for this. One of the ones that I heard when I was going to graduate school, some of the classes that I was in had 500 people in them. And as you might guess, a lot of times the person who was in charge, the professor, he didn't grade anything or she didn't grade anything. They had graduate assistants or teaching assistants that graded things. All right, you might say, okay, that sort of makes sense. But it was even more than that. Typically, there was a whole wall that you had to go through. In other words, if I would call down there and I would have a question for the professor, a lot of times I'd get a graduate assistant first. If the graduate assistant couldn't answer it, she or he would send it to a teaching assistant. And if they couldn't answer it, then it would go to the professor. All right? In the same way, what you typically do is you put your first mode of defense in as HTML5 form validation. Then and remember, some people with older browsers, and they're getting to be less and less, can't do that validation. All right, so the second wave that you put in there is JavaScript. All right, but again, there are ways to circumvent JavaScript. You can turn it off. All right, which is one way. You can go in and turn off JavaScript. So the third wave is to put in almost the same validations you'd put in using JavaScript. You put them in on the server side. Okay, so you do all three of them, and that's what they talk about in here. All right, so they define validation here on the top of 366 as the process of checking what information provided by users conforms to rules. So there's some kind of a standard that you have to adhere to. All right, for instance, I can set it up, and this is very hard to do. It may not sound like it, but what I'm about to tell you is very hard to do. Okay, so for instance, first name. You might say, well, that's not hard. The only thing you would allow in a first name would be alphabetic letters, right? Well, what if you're doing it in other countries? In other countries, it's possible for a person, what is that, German? That where they can put the two little dots over letters in there. In Spain, they can put the tilde over certain letters, etc. Those then would not be acceptable. It is possible for a person to have a first name that's hyphenated. Even though it's one word, it's hyphenated. All right, that kind of thing. So it's really hard to do that. And when you start to do that, we look at this a little bit towards the end of the chapter. You start to write what are called regular expressions. All right, regular expressions are another one of those things that if you can get really good at regular expressions, you can usually get a job and keep a job. All right, years ago, I ordered it not because I was going to use it, but I just was amazed. I got a thing, are you interested in this book for possible adoption for a class? And I don't normally do that. If somebody's going to send me a book that's worth $50 to $100, if I have no intention to use it, I don't think it's right for me to order. But this one was just called Regular Expressions, and it was 600 pages long. And that's all it was on, was regular expressions. Like what? Like making sure that if you put a zip code in, it's either got 5 digits or 5 digits followed by a hyphen followed by 4 digits and nothing else. If you've got a phone number and you require an area code, so that it'll be number, dash, number, dash, number, or you might allow the area code to be put in parentheses. Those are regular expressions. All right? There are other things that you can do with it too. For instance, let's say I ask the salary, and it's possible that the place I'm asking for a salary, that the person working there is a volunteer, so they take no salary. But I also say that the maximum salary somebody can make, one thing I'll give Trump credit for is, I don't know if you've heard, he said he's taking $1 for each year to be president. All right, so he does have that income, but he's giving up that $400,000. But if it was a job, let's say in Congress, and let's say that $400,000 was the maximum that somebody could get. All right, we can set that up. Okay, these are all things that you can set up with regular expressions, and there's more also. All right. So they talk about these, and again, what it's all about, and it's a big thing as far as going in and being able to do these regular expressions. All right. So regular expressions are things that you do with a form. Now, please look at this. It says these are properties of form objects. So that says forms themselves can have an autocomplete. All right, you maybe have seen that already when you've done forms. Maybe you've done that with forms where you put in a state and you put in a W and immediately comes up with WA, which is Washington. And typically if you type it in fast enough, like I used to do that with Illinois, when I typed it in I, it came up with Iowa, which is IA. But if I typed it in IL real quick, boom. All right, it was sometimes faster than clicking the drop down and then choosing the one you want. All right, this is kind of important. Elements. Returns a collection of the form's elements. If that sounds a little bit like the document object model, it's because it is similar. All right, length. Returns an integer with the number of elements that are in a form. So if you wanted to write a real generic script that would check every element you had in a form, you might be able to do it in one routine. That'd be a big routine, but one of the things you might want to do then is put in a for loop that would say go from 0 to the length -1. So if I had 15 elements on my form, it would go from 0 to 14, type of an idea. All right, and then no validate. Notice what it says, disables browser-based validation by a browser when set to false. So if you say, basically, if you don't want to validate, you're saying, hey, I know, just don't validate it. Sometimes developers set that no validate rule because while they're testing, they're not concerned. They just want to see if everything lines up, it looks okay with the CSS, etc. They're not doing testing of the values yet. But typically, you're going to want to make sure that, no, you want it set to validation once the thing is actually up and running. All right, submit. A lot of times you'll end up putting JavaScript code. You're going to see this in the examples we go over tomorrow. Why? Because that's when you click the submit button. That's typically when you want everything to fire. If I've got a simple form, let's just say it's got 4 fields in it, okay? Let's just say I put a name in there, that's it. Name, address, city, and state. Just keep it real simple, those 4 fields, all right? I have no guarantee that the person is going to fill them out in the order 1, 2, 3, 4. Would you agree with that? Somebody could put the state in first for whatever reason. So I don't know that they're done until they click the submit button. That's sending a signal to the system that at least in their mind, they're done. right, and that's what they're talking about here. Some of the methods, again, notice submit is an event of a form object, and it's really a method of a form object. All right. Check validity indicates browser-based validation of form controls, returns true if all controls are valid. That's something that's built in, that you don't have to write your own for that. All right. So what you could do is you could use that check validity thing, and you could check each field. And if you found one that was invalid, you could set check validity to false. But if everything was, if you didn't set anything to false, it would be set to true, meaning that everything that's in there is valid. And that's exactly what they're showing you right there. Some of the other stuff that you work with. And again, this is what? The bottom of page 365. Autofocus. That should make sense to you. All right? As it says, that's the element that should receive the focus when the form is loaded. Typically, it's the top element on the form. Doesn't have to be, but it usually is. You know what placeholder. You know what required is. This one is kind of hinky. Validation message. All right? What that means is, you know this already, that if you set a field to required and then you leave it off, you get that message from HTML, correct? But you can go in with validation message and put your own message in there. The problem with using that is it doesn't work the same in all browsers. All right, so typically people just use the standard error message that gets put in there. All right? All right, validity, as it says, returns true if control passes all the browser-based validation rules. Value is the value of a control, and will validate returns true if the constraint validation is enabled for the control. So what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to build two forms as a class. Maybe I'll even give you the forms, but they're going to be fairly small. But they'll be indicative of the kind of thing that you would typically write, okay? And the idea is we'll go over the major things and how to do validation. Then what you'll do for the test, for lack of better words, is almost combine what we'll do in those two examples tomorrow. And you'll write your own form and you'll put in your own validation. Does that make sense? I mean, I really want people to be well prepared for this test. I'm not going to lie to you. Many of you did very badly on this last test. A lot of you who normally get A's struggled to get a C. All right? And that's why we're going to spend a good hour tomorrow going over that last problem. All right? And I'm not saying that was an easy problem. It wasn't. All right. So there's check validity, set custom validity. You're not going to use a lot of these, just so you know. Ones that you might use. To me, one of the neatest routines is blur. Blur is the opposite of focus. When something has the focus, that's literally. So if I have, let's suppose, draw this real quick, but I have a very simple form. And let's say all it has in here is first name and it has last name. And when you, and maybe a submit button. All right, and I've got this set up that when the program first starts to run, my cursor's right here. All right, that means that I have to set the focus to that, okay? But if I take my mouse and I either tab here or I click here, two things happen. A blur event happens here and a focus event happens here. Does that make sense? The reason that that's important is you can literally put validation in your routine, and I've done this before, where I put, in there, let's just say that that's a mandatory field. So if you put nothing in there and I tab to the next field, yeah, I could give a message and that's fine and dandy, but I can literally cause a blur to happen and I can cause the focus to go back there. So I can force the user to stay in that field until they put in something. That's quite often how focus and blur are used together. Change is a really powerful one. It may not sound like it, but in here, if I put in this, if I put Jeff in here, 4 change events took place. After the J, after the E, after the F, and after the F. So again, I can put code in that checks and says, for one thing, let's just suppose, I have no idea if there's any culture that ever has numbers in a name. I don't think so. But let's suppose we say that putting numbers in for a first name is illegal. So I can put a change event in that every time I put a character in there, the only thing I'll accept maybe is a blank space or a letter or a hyphen or a whatever. So I can do that using a change event. All right, we're going to see some of that as we go on. All right. You'll have to be able to start getting used to this. All right. So as it says on 366 on the bottom of the page, it says most developers use getElementById and getElementsByTagName. It says you should be aware there's another way to address form objects. By default, browsers create collections. All right. This book uses this code. This is one way that you can do this. All right. This supposes that you've got a form tag in there. That would make sense. Now, this isn't going to work like this if you've got more than one form on a page. You can put multiple forms on a page. It is legal to do that. So then I would probably want to give each form an ID and use the getElementById instead of the getElementsByTagName. All right, but if you do it by tag name here, 0, as it says, that means, as it says, it refers to the form object that contains only one form. But it's more often than that, it'll be written like this. So you can write it either way. That's the bottom line. All right. It says you can reference the third element, 0, 1, 2, like this. Okay? And there's other ways that you can do it. You can use the name. We're going to look at a few of these when we go over a couple of examples tomorrow. All right, so if it doesn't totally make sense, let's just hold off on it until then, okay? In this chapter, as it says, you're going to work with Snoot Flowers of Davenport, Iowa. All right, it says we want to enhance their website. The website is complete, but it doesn't validate. So that's what you're going to do. So this is the one that you'll be working with in here. And again, the good news is you've already done a lot of this kind of stuff. You understand what checkboxes are, what text areas are, what text fields are, what drop-down lists are, what checkboxes are, and I guess they don't have any radio buttons in there, but you get all that stuff. All right? Another thing that they'll talk about doing in here, and maybe you've seen this before, is a lot of times you'll fill out an address here. You'll fill out an address right there, and when you fill out the address, come on. Oh, that's lovely. When you fill out the address, there'll be a thing below. Maybe it'll be a shipping and a regular address or whatever, and you click a button. You can't see it very well, but it's right here that says same as the billing. So you fill it out once, you click it, and it'll fill it out again for you. All right, let me turn this off and turn it back on. That's better. All right. Well, it's better on the screen. It's not better on there, I guess, huh? All right, it's going to make me get out and get back in again. Yeah, that's lovely. Well, that's a little better, but not better. Hopefully that'll fix it. Hopefully I won't hit it anymore. So. All right, so again, that's the one that you're going to be working on throughout the chapter. And as always, I'm not going to go over those steps. Okay? All right. Turning up to page 369, they talk about improving form usability. And again, you know a lot of this stuff already. When a form, you want a form to be two things. You want it to be usable, you want it to be accessible. All right? To make it usable, you want to make it as hard as possible for someone to screw it up. Placeholders are used for usability, right? All right. Even though you might have a label there that says first name, you still can put in placeholder text that says enter your first name here. All right. And maybe you've noticed this. I noticed this when I fill out, because I get a lot of stuff online. It used to be they'd always ask for your name. Okay. okay? And then they'd ask for your email address. More and more of these places are now just asking for your first name as opposed to asking for your full name, all right? Which is much easier, it's less typing for you, and I guess they feel they can be a little more personal than by calling you just by your first name. All right, accessibility, on the other hand, is you want to make sure that people who have any kind of impairment, any kind of liability, if you want to look at it that way, they're blind, they're hard of hearing, they're whatever, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to use. So again, we shouldn't have to talk about option buttons, checkboxes, selection lists, sliders, data lists. You've looked at all those already. All right, there's nothing new that's in there. What is new is, as they say right here, programming forms to increase content accuracy. The idea is you want to make it as difficult as possible for someone to screw up. I mean, if someone is bound and determined to screw up, or they really rush through things without reading anything, they can still screw it up. All right? Now, some of the things that we'll look at, as an example, you may or may not be aware of this. We did talk about this earlier on in the HTML part of the class. If you've got a drop-down list and the selected index property is set to -1, that means nothing is chosen, okay? Now, you might not like this, but one of the things I'm going to require that you do on the test next week, just as a little heads up for you, is we'll have a drop-down list for states. I'm not going to make you put in all 50 states. I'm not going to do something like that. All right, maybe we'll put in 5, I don't know. But the point is, a lot of times, and you may or may not have seen this, but at the top, it'll say, select the state, all right? And if it doesn't do that, then typically it defaults to Alabama, because that's the first state, in the union as far as the alphabet is, in the alphabet. All right. The problem is that if you don't take the time to fill that out, and now it's Wentzville, Alabama, which there probably isn't one. Okay. So typically you put in there select the state because you can then check that. And if the person still has it set to select a state, they did not select a state. All right? So that's the kind of thing that you're going to have to do on the test. All right. Here's other things about the select element. And again, that's not my intention is to go through this because we already have. Now, you may need a primer, or some review. You may need to go back and take a look at this stuff. All right? But you'll be able to do okay on the test with just going back and looking at it, the day before the test or whatever, I would think. All right. So here's an example where they put no display in there whatsoever. That's another way you could do that. We could have a state and have nothing selected whatsoever. We've already talked about this. So you could say, please put a state here. All right. You could just have it default to the first state, which is Alabama. You could leave it blank. Or remember, if you say selected equals selected, or just selected. So for instance, if we were doing one for Rankin, we might set the state to Missouri by default, because the majority of people who go here are from Missouri. All right. All right. Again, options, same thing. It's not. I don't feel the need to go over that stuff. All right. Kind of a neat little graphic here. This is 376 in the book because they're trying to show you this stuff. Okay. One thing you want to check for is, if you're checking for somebody's birth date. Okay. If they put in February 31st, that should raise an error, correct? If they put in February 29th, you might have to run a leap year check to make sure that the year that they say they were born was a leap year. Because if it wasn't, either they put in something wrong, either they put in the wrong day, or they put in the wrong year. All right? Now, what's powerful about this, notice what we do in here. Program the days list to change dynamically based on the selected month and year. So it'll know if it's this month, if it's month 11, That should always be set to 30. All right? And it'll know the only one you're really going to ever have to check on that for, that it could change, is February. But you'll know that other than February, every month has got either 31 or 30 days in it. Okay? And if you set it up like this, you're making it hard for it, to screw up. You won't allow them to choose a November 31st. All right? All right, there's a pretty long exercise in here that goes all the way to page 381. And then on the bottom of page 381, after the graphic that's there, they talk about placeholder text. You know what that is. We've already worked with placeholder text. Again, the authors of this book don't know whether or not the people who have going through this book, this is a JavaScript book. It's not an HTML book. But to truly understand JavaScript, you need some HTML background. So the author gives you that in a lot of the chapters, this being one of them. So they go through a placeholder exercise, and that's pretty long. All right, that goes all the way to page, because it's broken up into different parts. That literally goes all the way up to page 393. All right, so about 10 pages worth. But there's a lot of good material that's in there. Some of you who've been struggling either on the written tests or on the hands-on tests, I would strongly suggest that you take a little more time and go back over these exercises again before the test. You have a question? Oh, okay. All right. On 393, on the very bottom of the page, customizing browser-based validation. As it says, basically without exception, even the best form that you can design requires some kind of validation. One of the main reasons, as they say there, is most forms contain text boxes, and any text box can conceivably have wrong type of information put into it. How do you get around that? You know already that one way you can get around it is using some of the HTML5 validation. There it is. I'm not going to go over any of that because we've already looked at that. It says here, values for the type that trigger browser-based evaluation. All right, different things. Color is an easy one to screw up, especially if you allow people to put in colors in multiple ways. All right, can they put in red? Can they just put in the word red? Do they have to put it in a hex code? Etc. No, I didn't touch it, that thing. All right. So again, you go over this and over this. What's kind of neat in here is this. The author literally has you set it up with a bunch of required fields. So ideally, when you click the submit button, every field that's in there that's a required field will light up. All right, by default, it'll be kind of a pink or an off red. All right, and that's one of the things that you end up doing in here. Another thing, if we turn up to page 397, now this is not a good example. And what I mean by that is this book does not talk about server-based code whatsoever. We get into some server-based code next semester in ASP.NET. ASP.NET is a server-based language. But all the author does here is when you're done, they literally just print out a results page that says this is all the stuff you entered. That's not typically the way that it's going to be done. If you've ever gone online and filled out any kind of form, you know as well as I do that what's going to happen is if everything was okay, it says, congratulations, Brady, you are now registered. Something like that. All right? But they're doing this so that you can verify everything that you put in and make sure that everything worked okay. All right, so they start talking then on the next page, customizing browser-based validation feedback. These are some things, okay? And again, you want to set it up where you never want to talk down to the person who's going through your form or whatever. You don't want to give them the like the idea. I had a guy, a student years ago. He used to write "No, idiot," and those were his error messages. Then he changed it, and I won't tell you what he changed it to because the word at least has a connotation of being dirty. All right, and after I took off the second time quite a bit, he didn't do it anymore. I was like, well, why? And I'm like, you wouldn't do that in the real world. Not if you wanted to get business and keep it. He used the word dickweed. And he started calling everybody that every time you did something wrong. And I'm like, that's not a nice thing to say. No, it's putting together a couple things. It's not considered a dirty word. Spell check didn't like it. I don't care. I didn't like it either. So on the top of page 399, it says, setting a custom error message for a control changes the validity of that control to false. That should make sense. All right. It says here there's some methods of the constraint validation in the API. They will talk about these things in here. There are so many ways that you can validate. We're going to look at 2 tomorrow. All right. And I don't even know if I still have that one, but I'll look for it. And if I can find it, I'll show you another one. I'll just give you that code because it's done using jQuery. With jQuery, they've got a plugin, a validation plugin that works really nice. You have to set up rules and stuff, which takes a little bit of time. But after you do that, it's almost flawless in the way it works. You can customize error messages. You can do whatever you want to do, and it works really nice in that way. All right, so they give you an example here. They've got a thing called first name. All right, and as it says, if it's missing, you can call this set custom validity. Again, that's set custom validity right here. So there are built-in things you can call, or you can write your own. And typically, you use this as an example here, in conjunction with something else. So notice they're setting the custom validity, and they also, in some place in here, are going to set the F name to invalid, which is going to kick that in. All right. Now, you probably wouldn't have it like this, first name invalid. You probably would have something that's called invalid because you probably don't, unless you want to set the background colors to different colors for different fields. Most people don't do that, but you can. So they show that's what's going to happen. As it says, this is on page 400. The background color changes to pink. Okay, and all browsers that support browser-based validation will display the bubble text. That should be anything IE8 or later, which is probably going to handle about between 95 and 98% of all browsers that are out there. All right, the way that it's done may look different in different browsers. Okay, just so you know that the bubble, etc., may look a little bit different in IE as opposed to Firefox as opposed to Chrome. On 401, notice to disable browser-based validation for the order form. All right. So as it says, you can turn it off. You can even check to see whether or not that's set to no validate. All right. If that happened, you may want to put up a message either for you, if you're the tester, or for somebody else who's testing or whatever, that says, put an alert up, for example. You wouldn't show that to a quote, regular user or an end user. But again, while you're creating something, you might not be concerned with validation at that time. You're more concerned with the appearance and getting the form to look the way you want it to look. All right. Next, starting on 402, the author talks there, as it says here, programming custom validation. You all know this already. In English, what the author is saying is This is validation that you want things to say exactly what you want them to say. You might want to do things like check that required fields contain something. You may or may not be aware of this, but for years, the way that people got around all this stuff, and the fix was real simple, but you had a form, and the form had a bunch of fields in there, and the fields were required. Well, back in the day, what you could do is you could hit the space bar, and that would put an entry in there. All right? But I think we've talked about this routine already, but if you've never seen it before, the trim routine it removes all beginning and leading spaces. So if I put, for example, in space, space, my name, space, 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 and I call trim on that field, it would remove the leading spaces and the ending spaces. The reason that that's important is if somebody says I'm going to circumvent this by just hitting space, space, that'll remove both those spaces, and now the field essentially is empty. That's why that's important. All right? So they show you what they want it to look like. The author's got his use of color in there on page 403. All right? Now, you'll notice there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a message. So again, it's a card store. What do you want the message to say, type of thing. Where there are some built-in ones, or you can put in your own. All right? There's the billing and the delivery, which again might be the same, might not be the same. There's another one for date. This is a lot more intricate than the way you'd probably do it. But you build this throughout so you get a lot of practice working with forms and validating what's in forms. All right? Typically, again, when you want that form validation to click in is when the submit button is pressed. That's what's mentioned here on page 404. All right? And I haven't looked for the fall semester. I haven't started reading the ASP.NET book that I think that Evan's going to want us to use. But I don't know how much work we're going to do on validation, but again, we'll look at it again. And they run you through, again, a very long exercise on this. All right, turning up to page 409. Notice that the whole chart, or the whole page, this page and half of the next page. Commonly used input elements and their associated properties. This should all be stuff you're familiar with. I'll go back and check, and we'll do the test review in a little bit, but I don't believe there's anything on the test that's going to say what is checked mean, etc. If there is, I'll let you know what that is. We've already talked about blur. Click is what you think it would be. We've talked about focus already. All right. So they give you some examples of things that you can use. This is the kind of code you're going to be writing. So you're checking the first name and you're checking the value of the first name. Equal, 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 meaning has it been left empty? All right, and if it is, that's the code that you want to run. They just put in there as a comment. But they show you, again, in another fairly long exercise on 411, 412, 413, 414, 415, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. This is not the same exercise, it's multiple exercises because they break it down by different type of form control. All right? The last thing that I'll mention in here in this section is I'm going to turn all the way up to page almost 20 pages to page 429, and on that page the author says they're validating content type and custom functions. the exercise that starts on the bottom of 429 and it finishes up the chapter up till 432, I'm not going to make you do this, but this is probably the most important part of the chapter. Why? Because it's on credit card validation. All right? And different credit cards, most credit cards usually are 16 digits, so that's one thing that you can check for. But the way that MasterCards are numbered is different from the way that American Express cards are numbered, is different from the way that Visa cards are numbered. All right? If you've never seen that before, if you've ever filled out a form where they ask you, they might have radio buttons for the type of credit card you have. I've got a MasterCard. So if I type that in and I put in my number, it'll usually accept it without any problem. But if I change that radio button from MasterCard to Visa, it'll usually kick out a problem. And it'll say that that's an invalid number to use because, again, it's a different numbering system typically that they use. All right? That's why I don't know if you've ever heard this, but typically, if I know where you're born, I can probably tell you the first 3 digits of your Social Security number. All right? And typically it's done by state. I know that's changing because as more and more people are born, more and more people are dying out. There's problems with that. But it's funny because I remember one time somebody asking me I was living in Illinois, and I gave them my first 3 digits. Oh, you're from Wisconsin, huh? You know, wow, how'd you know that? All right. But it's really important, and again, this is the exercise. It starts on the bottom of 429, and it goes all the way to 432, and they show in there on 432. That's the end of the chapter. Okay? I mean, it's one thing to just put in letters instead of numbers. All right? And there's the radio buttons, the expiration date, and it's funny. My MasterCard expires at the end of November. And at the beginning of November, they sent me a new one that instead of expiring in 11/16, it now expires at 11/19. But it's funny because I don't use my card a lot, but I used it twice this month, and both times it came up on the screen with a warning saying, warning, your card expires at this month. At the end of this month, you should, put in, revalidate it or whatever the heck it was. All right. Plus, with that's the expiration date. Plus, you get that extra number that's in there on the end. All right. And most people don't realize this. Okay, and I'm going to say this, and you may disagree with me with what I'm about to say, but I'm basing this on people that I've talked to who are security people. All right, and especially one of my best friends who was a cryptologist in the Army. But by and large, when you give information online and it's HTTPS, and you give information of a credit card, it's usually actually more secure than if you're talking on the phone and giving somebody the information. There's usually a better chance somebody's going to be able to get that information, not on your end, but somebody who's able to get it on the other end than there is for them getting your information online. All right? It's a generalization, but pretty much it's true. All right. So that's the end of the chapter. And after the break, we're going to go through again. You notice you've got a bunch of the key terms that are in here. But after the break, we're going to go over the... So let's take a break. It's 9:39. Let's come back at 5 to 10. We'll take about 20 minutes or so. And again, we'll go over the test review for this.